All right, everyone. Welcome to the ninth and final panel for the Eaton Speculative Fiction Conference. This panel is Queering Ontologies, Rethinking the Human. We have 5 presenters, so we're doing something of a lightning round. I've asked every presenter to briefly introduce themselves at the beginning of their presentation, and we're going to kind of just do a bit of a rapid fire, etc. Since I'm the first presenter, I will introduce myself. My name is Ripley Baker. I go by Baker, he, they pronouns, and I'm from UC Santa Barbara. My work, very broadly speaking, is on environmental humanities, climate justice, and divergence as a form of critical world building. And my paper for you today is on transfuturity and re-narrativizing the biological human in Becky Chambers' To Be Taught If Fortunate and Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood trilogy. Let me share screen so that we can see slides, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Can't resist a good pun, so I also had to talk about it as transgressing nature. So, jumping right into it. On January 20th, 2025, his very first day in office, President Donald Trump signed an executive order whose title seems to be straight out of a darkly satirical, if perhaps a bit heavy-handed, science fiction novel. The Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government order, dressed up in the trappings of safeguarding women's rights from the predations of delusional men and the so-called quote-unquote woke mob, outlines a number of specifics. These include establishing a laughably simplistic definition of one's, quote, immutable biological classification as either male or female, based solely on the gametes one produces, demands that federal employees, quote, enforce laws governing sex-based rights and opportunities based on biologically distinct sexes, requiring all government-issued identification documents, including passports and visas, to reflect the holder's assigned sex at birth, never mind the fact that U.S. passports didn't require sex markers at all until 1977, and perhaps most chillingly, declares that, quote, agencies shall take all necessary steps to end the federal funding of gender ideology. This final declaration sparked a mass digital erasure from federal websites, including the CDC, the Department of Education, and the National Park Service. These erasures included guidelines offering support for trans and intersex students, policies designed to mitigate sexual harassment or abuse toward trans employees in the workplace, and even the barest acknowledgement that trans, intersex, and non-binary people exist at all. Any objection to this state of affairs was and is often swiftly met with a contemptuous and now common rejoinder that, quote, it's just basic biology. Despite the fact that studies have shown that fewer than 30% of non-LGBTQ Americans personally know a transgender individual, or the fact that trans people make up roughly 1% of the population, in recent years, the slew of anti-trans headlines, acrimonious pundits who weaponize, quote, just asking questions, social media harassment campaigns, and unprecedented levels of anti-trans legislation have made it seem as though trans people are legion, a barely contained woke mob of delusional perverts denying scientific reality, brainwashing cisgender children who are poised on the cusp of destroying America as we know it. According to this discourse, which tends to parrot the apparently unassailable language of science, it's only the thin blue line of empirical sanity and, of course, police surveillance that can save us all from the mad contagion that is, quote, gender ideology. In other words, it was never just about bathrooms. I will not waste the short time that I have here with you arguing against these absurd allegations. I've wasted far too much of my life already attempting to justify my simple right to exist for those who choose to see neither me nor my kind as fully human. Rather, in this presentation, I engage with an archive that interrogates and challenges the boundaries of the human itself, understanding it as mutable, porous, and far more inclusive than the proponents of this basic biology would care to imagine. Drawing on the work of interdisciplinary post-colonial scholar Sylvia Wynter, I'll first outline her sociogenic theory of human being as inherently hybrid and non-static, existing as we do at the nexus of biology, history, psychology, and semantically reinforced cultural norms and expectations. Then I will very briefly delve into two works of astrobiological science fiction, Becky Chambers' To Be Taught If Fortunate, and Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood trilogy, both of which theorize the biocultural reinvention of the human in concert with non-human actors, with whom they must learn to live alongside peacefully. Despite not explicitly dealing with transgender issues, both texts, and Butler's in particular, are very deeply concerned with questions of gender, consent, dysphoria, and euphoria regarding the genetic alteration of the human body, often in ways that defy hierarchical or gender essentialist notions about innate capabilities or the proper roles one should play within complex social organizations. These understand diversity as a source of strength rather than a source of threat. Interestingly, both texts also feature transgender characters who are easy to miss or misconstrue if you aren't looking for them. In so doing, the novels also begin the work of not only deconstructing simplistic notions about biological determinism, but also reimagining human futurity as a multi-species endeavor that requires radical change in order to survive on and beyond a climate-ravaged Earth. As a playwright, novelist, and transdisciplinary scholar, Caribbean writer Sylvia Wynter has published prolifically on issues surrounding the hierarchical and racialized construction of identity, colonial and post-colonial histories of conquest and epistemicide, and origin stories surrounding what it means to be biologically, socially, and culturally human, as well as what it means to be othered, or as Wynter puts it, deselected from this category. Throughout her work, Wynter is understandably most interested in interrogating and deconstructing the racist and colonial legacies of violence that continue to plague Black and Indigenous populations within the Americas. Nevertheless, she refuses to limit her inquiries to culturally specific sites of struggle, continuously expanding outward into interrogating the very foundations of the human itself. In so doing, she theorizes humanness as a fundamentally hybrid state of being, equally brought about by our ontogeny, that is, bios, psychology, logos, and sociogeny, mythos. In other words, a human is not simply an animal driven by biological imperatives. Human nature does indeed exist, but not as a thing in itself, because humans do not and cannot exist as people, outside of the elaborate narrative cosmogonies that we weave for ourselves and our souls with regard to how one ought to act within a community, how one ought to exist within a world. The danger, Wynter argues, drawing on the work of Césaire, Fanon, and Du Bois, is in the historical failure to recognize these myths as myths, and to take them instead as immutable, divinely or empirically inspired truths whose challenge amounts to heresy. However, under Western colonial expansion, which was based first, historically speaking, on apparently unassailable notions of divine right, and later, into the present day, on similarly unassailable notions of economic or scientific might, such stories come to be all-pervasive. These mistake the map for the territory. Such linear notions of progress, success, and otherwise quote-unquote correct ways of being are characterized, of course, through a white patriarchal, colonial, neoliberal, heterosexual, cisgender, and otherwise fundamentally Western normative lens, style themselves as existing outside of culture, as objective rationality, as opposed to culturally inactive histories or stories that serve a given cultural purpose. Under such circumstances, the categorical genres of human, that is, who is considered obviously human, provisionally human, or a dangerous savage who is not human at all, are understood as axiomatic or obvious. Any objection to this state of affairs is swiftly met with the contemptuous rejoinder that it's just basic biology. In order to break out of this episteme, Wynter argues that we need to collectively challenge and reimagine the biocultural boundaries of the human itself. In the interest of time, I'll comment only briefly on the two texts that I outline in the introduction of this presentation, with the hope that I might extend these conversations into the Q&A period, and that members of the audience might see fit to investigate these excellent works of astrobiological science fiction on their own. The first, Becky Chambers' 2019 novella, To Be Taught If Fortunate, envisions human space exploration that's made possible via a novum technology known as somaforming, in which astronauts bioengineer their bodies in order to actively adapt themselves to fit the exoplanet ecologies they study, rather than the other way around. These changes include the ability to absorb radiation and convert it to nourishment, to withstand heavy gravitational pulls, and even to glitter in the low visibility world of an ice moon whose life resides far below the surface. In the novel, questions of agency and acceptance surrounding these extensive, although temporary, changes the scientists choose to make to their bodies are accompanied simultaneously by the euphoria of discovery, the ironclad imperative not to colonize and to leave as little of an impact as possible on the worlds they visit, and the elegiac acceptance that despite these wonders, the astronomical distances involved in such exploration mean that they will never again see the Earth that they once knew, or the people, now long dead, whom they still love. When they return, if they return, it will be to a world that has culturally changed to such an unimaginable extent that their own biological changes will seem tiny and insignificant by comparison. My second text, Octavia Butler's 1987 through 1989 Lilith's Brood trilogy, offers a more in-depth and problematized exploration of a dying human race's encounter with biological change in the form of an intelligent alien species called the Oankali, whose technology is almost entirely biological in origin, whose entire sense of cultural identity, as well as long-term survival, is based on the ability to genetically manipulate themselves and their environments via the exchange of genetic material with other sentient species. Having rescued all surviving humans from a nuclear irradiated Earth, which they've been in the process of painstakingly restoring over the course of centuries since, the Oankali, in return, the Oankali require a trade with the humans. They wish to propagate with them, creating hybrid Oankali human children, which, according to the Oankali at least, will simultaneously infuse their species with much needed genetic fresh material into Oankali bloodlines, and to, quote, cure humans of what the Oankali see as the fatal defect of our biology, that of being simultaneously intelligent but also hierarchical, beings that are thus uniquely positioned to destroy ourselves via ever-escalating intergroup aggression, a fate only narrowly avoided in the novel by Oankali intervention. According to Winter, what is necessary to re-story the human is to give humanness a different future by giving it a different past. Extending Winter's argument into the realm of science fiction, I argue that part of this work might be accomplished through this restoring or reimagining of humanness through alternative speculative futures in which the human is forced to contend with its own biological mutability and the resulting sociocultural repercussions in the context of human encounters with people, environments, and otherness whose legibility is, in fact, not human at all. Thank you.
Hey everyone. My name is Maria Job. I am also doing my PhD at UCSB, and my work is also in the environmental humanities. I went through several iterations for different project ideas, and then I've landed on this one that I'm committing to. And it's going to sound a little strange, but it has to do with different how to reconceptualize what eating is, and as a result of that, closely what food is within this particular environmental moment. So that's what I'm conceptualizing as the larger project, and I haven't really identified myself as an SF person per se. Most of the fiction that I've been studying has really been the modernist realist text. So I'm very new to the field, but it's helping me, particularly fantasy text and the speculative is helping me sort of engage with these two different kinds of epistemologies. So yes, okay. So I'm going to get into it. My paper is called The Metabolics of Light Eating in Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. A few months ago, I started noticing speculative fiction that discusses a variety of light eaters or photosynthetic eaters. Imaginations of photosynthetic eating appear as photosynthesizing tattoos in Kim Stanley Robinson's short story Oral Argument, and as light-eating humans in Jerry Olson's short story Stuffing, as well as light-eating leaf heads in Adam Roberts' novel By Light Alone. In addition to fiction writers, artists Michael Burton and Michiko Neta speculate human organs enhanced with photosynthetic algae in the Alga Culture Project, which authors of the Anthropocene Cookbook describe as a form of eating which is emerging alongside this current environmental moment. In 2024, the science journalist and author Zoe Schlanger released the book The Light Eaters, which was an apt title for the nonfiction book exploring the most recent evidence in plant intelligence and plant cognition. This thematic connection of light eating struck out to me as incredibly fascinating. The word phrase light eaters in particular stayed with me quite uncomfortably. Even in the context of the plant eater, it felt strange. Yes, plants eat light. We know this. We learned this in elementary school, if not before then. But why does it still feel uncanny to say plants are light eaters out loud? I began reading some food studies scholarship, and in particular, with a particular interest in non-human eating. And I think I've started arriving at a reason, and I think I'm starting to get a bit clearer as to what's going on. So I learned that food studies reveres the human eater. Works such as Global Appetites, Food and Literature, Gastro-Modernism, and the Cambridge Companion to Literature and Food offer useful methodological frameworks to consider the cultural and political question around food and food systems, yet their analytical approach consistently centers the human eater, eating, and food. Anne-Marie Moll's work, Eating in Theory, is a key interlocutor for my project. Moll takes cues from various modes of human eating to critique subjectivities and agencies that transpose themselves onto humanities scholarship. She offers a poignant critique of how metabolic processes like eating and breathing in humanist philosophical traditions are classified as the lowest forms of theoretical existence, wherein moving is situated somewhat higher, perception is above that, and thinking stands out as the highest ranked activity. While Moll's Eating in Theory decenters the thinking human by centering instead the eating human, my paper and larger project aims to center the non-human eater, asking how we might reimagine the eating that has been relegated to the margins of humanity's concerns. As Maria Christo in her work, Eating Otherwise, observes, non-human eating is often narrated as monstrous, bestial, unceremonious in Western philosophical thought, which showcases embedded human-centric ideologies which have shaped and influenced the cultural imagination of eating. The word unceremoniousness in the context of eating points to the notion that non-human eating is non-intellectual, which curtails our cultural capacity to imagine interlinked ecological processes that would not take place without thoughtful and cognitive plant, fungi, and animal eating. So I'm going to my first pretext text, which is, this is not speculative fiction. It's creative nonfiction, but written like in a very daydreamy, and it has like elements of speculativeness within the writing. So, if, for example, in Samana Roy's How I Became a Tree, she centers the hungry, desiring plant, which challenged the technical representation of autotrophic and photosynthetic eating as an automatic machine-like process. The Oxford English Dictionary defines photosynthesis as the process by which carbon dioxide is converted into organic matter in the presence of chlorophyll. Roy takes this technical definition and narrativizes it. Trees begin eating at dawn, she writes in her poem, You Think You Can Repair Flowers. Trees occupying the subject position, followed by their beginning to eat, brings back the ceremoniousness of eating as a sociocultural practice. That is, instead of our cultural imagination of plant eating as mechanical and non-cognitive, we are presented with the tree for whom there is a social and temporal quality to eating, as much as there is a social and temporal quality to human eating. Okay. Roy represents the eating plant using what I call a multi-species metabolics of eating, employing human and more than human sensoria. She writes, you want to hear the hunger inside grass like your stomach's growling. Grass growling, hunger, stomach point to an attempt to bridge the divides between the metabolic imaginary of plant leaves, which are sometimes referred to as kitchens that make food, to a metabolic imaginary of plants as beings that have a desire for food. So turning away from the mechanical framing of plants as entities that photosynthesize, I saw a certain potential with the words light eating in place of photosynthesis, both within and beyond the context of plants. In most light eating fiction I've come across so far, and I'm happy to have any recommendations if you know of any, the eater has some relationship with plants. They are either chimeras or genetically engineered to have plant qualities, or they are becoming plants in some capacity. In Han Kang's The Vegetarian, for example, the protagonist stops eating food and does not seem to require it as she slowly and increasingly becomes a plant as the novel progresses, absorbing light. So my presentation today, however, is on Ishiguro's presentation of light eating in Clara and the Sun, which I think offers us something different entirely. Here, our light eater Clara is a solar-powered robot and does not photosynthesize, but receives nourishment from the sun, in Ishiguro's words. From Clara's point of view, everything and every being eats light because she eats light. When Clara discusses the sun pouring his nourishment, it is the sun nourishing the buildings, the roads, and everything sunlight falls on and can fall on. For Clara, light is nourishment and basking is nourishing. So moving to another point, something that caught my attention in Clara and the Sun is that Clara, who eats and receives nourishment from the sun, ardently believes in destroying what is in the book called the Cootings machine. And this is some fan art, and like one of the tiles, the tile in the third row, third column, is like a representation of the Cootings machine, and that's the artist there in their Instagram account. So Clara believes that the Cootings machine, a petroleum-based fuel machine that emits smoke and blocks the sun, and destroying this machine is the only way to save Josie, her ailing human. I think there is something else going on entirely within the subtext of the plot here, wherein through this constructed pitting of solar technology against petroleum technology, Ishiguro shows the energy ideologies that these figures represent. So this particular context of light eating begins to take on a political dimension as it connects to solar power. And it helps me examine how questions of solar are represented as simultaneously ecological and metabolic, concerning both energy infrastructure and energetics of the body. And there is a querying of what it means to eat and what it means to be an eater with this confluence of food and fuel. I want to say at this point that I approach this pitting of solar against petroleum, and it's slightly written as like this ultimate good versus bad, like fashion, like of like a fantasy arc. And so I want to approach this with some, I think, necessary skepticism, given how they pedestalize the solar imaginary. As Imre Ziesman and Darren Barney write in their edited collection Solarity, and they quote, as organic is to food, solar is to energy, a virtuous substitute that dispels fears and anxieties about who is doing what with solar and why. My project echoes Seisman and Barney's skepticism toward the utopian visions of solar that overshadow the social politics of large-scale energy transition. The narrative of quote-unquote clean energy may carry a politics of racist purity, as described by Rhys Williams in their article Turning Towards the Sun, which discusses new foods that use solar technology and which position itself as quote-unquote cleaner than modern industrial agriculture, just as solar is positioned as quote-unquote cleaner than its energy predecessors, coal and oil. So while there is the ecological dimension of solar, I want to consider how these ecological dimensions are always grounded within materialist and social realities. It is also important to note that in Clara and Son, Ishiguro does not present solar as food, but as nourishment, a difference that I think is key to the central fantasy of the novel. Which is Clara's witnessing, and this happens right at the start of the text, and this is what is like the initial setup. There's this moment where, quote, a beggar man and his dog are brought back to life by the sun, end quote. And hence Clara believes that the sun will also heal Josie in the same way. And this representation of solar, not only in the context of energy and fuel, but also as healing and as medicinal, as divine and as magic, is important since it opens up the interpretation of food, not in its like caloric sense, wherein the body is rendered as some kind of thermodynamic engine, but it opens up questions surrounding the subjective and fantastic stuff around food and the body. Food is healing and light eating is healing. This reading helps assert one of my project's central claim that eating in the Anthropocene necessitates new definitions beyond the caloric, countering like Heather Paxson in her work Eating Beside Ourselves, and what she describes as nutrition science's dominant paradigm built on mythic ideas of the calorie and quantitative equilibrium and fantasies of universal exchange. So my reading therefore points to interpretations of light as nourishment, wherein bodies are not engines that need fuel, but they are multi-species messes that need many different kinds of feedings. To conclude, I attend to fantastical eating relations in Clara and the Sun and wonder if they have the potential to destabilize capitalist food ideologies represented by the calorie, and as they are situated within the imagination of global energy transition. And Ishiguro's fantastical eating relations signal a renewed vocabulary of planetary metabolism and reconfigures food relations through an ontological questioning of what eating is and can be. Ishiguro's literary imagination of a humanoid solar-powered robot is a text that I think works well in conversation with questions of solarity. And I'm going to conclude with this final quote by Ziesman and Barney, who describe our contemporary turn to solar as one of the most powerful ideologies blurring concept, fantasy, and infrastructure together in a manner that makes it difficult to disentangle solar fiction from solar reality.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ruiying Zhang. I'm a first-year PhD student in Asian Studies at Cornell University, and my research mainly revolves around narratives about technology, including science fiction and the history of technology in contemporary China, mainly after the 1949. So today I will present my paper, Integrating Humans with Machines, Cybernetics and Early 1960s Chinese Science Fiction. So at first glance of this title, you might have several questions like, did science fiction exist in 1960s China, which was still under Chairman Mao Zedong's government and is usually considered as a period during which the technological development was quite lagging behind. And also the literature during that period is usually considered as a kind of didactic literature. And also, did cybernetic, a theory founded by American scientist Norbert Wiener and discussed at Matthew Conference in North America, did this theory reach China during the 1960s? And if so, how did Chinese scientists, writers, and readers interpret cybernetics in relation, especially in relation to the human-machine integration? So my article explores the human-machine imagination in 1960s Chinese science fiction and its connection to the early dissemination of cybernetics in China. In my article, I made three main arguments. The first one is a kind of historical description that the cybernetics entered China as early as the 1950s and influenced Chinese science fiction, which was termed as science fantasy literature during that time. So your previous study have focused on the influence of system theories, cybernetics, and information theory, mainly on 1980s China, on the literature and humanities. For example, Xiao Liu's book, Information Fantasies, examine post-socialist fantasy of the seamless human integration with the real-time information circuits. However, I argue that the connection between cybernetics and Chinese literature could be traced further back to the socialist era, to 1950, from 1950s. And my second argument is that in the middle 20th century China, cybernetics was primarily understood as a useful knowledge for automated production, mainly applied to industry. And this perspective is reflected in both the translation of cybernetics and the science fiction writing. My third argument is that, well, the dominant discourse in the science fiction and also other scientific writings, they emphasize a clear distinction between humans and machines because the Marxism theory the Marxist Maoist understanding of human-machine relationship does not admit the parallel between the human thought and the mechanical operation. But the fictional depictions hinted at a more complex vision of human-machine interaction, diverging from the rigid Marxist Maoist perspectives. Yeah. So this paper is actually it is a chapter of my MA thesis, and it was published last year in SFRA Review. So today, rather than going deeper and into the details, I will discuss the materials I used to develop this research. And also, additionally, I recently discovered some resources on cybernetics in 1960 China that have led me to reconsider some of my arguments. So for my research, I mainly used three kinds of primary sources. The first one is science fiction texts. Thanks to sci-fi fans and researchers and volunteers, a vast collection of published books, journal articles, and theoretical works on sci-fi has been collected and scanned. Although now digitalized, but you can get access to them on the scanned version. One key archive is this one, 九龙 Zhoulong project, where you can request some specific texts. However, unfortunately, I don't think they have the English version, and they do not provide a full list of the archive they collected. However, if you need something, you can just email them and reach out. They are very willing to give you the help. And also, for my study, to access the original printed journals and publications, I also visited the Shanghai library, which houses journals like Science Pictorial, 科学画报, and Juvenile Literature and Art, 少年文业. These are some of the 1950s to 1970s journals that publish science fiction. And also because I want to trace the history of the dissemination of cybernetics in socialist China, I need to find some articles about cybernetics in both non-academic publications and academic publications. For the non-academic publications, I used the People's Daily database. People's Daily is the largest newspaper of in China. And also I use on the right is Du Xiu. Okay, sorry, they don't have the English version because they only collected the Chinese journal articles. So I mainly use those two databases. But actually, unlike the late Qing and Republic era journals, which was pre the 1949, the post 1949 period articles are not that conveniently consolidated in a single database. So keyword search sometimes, yeah, it helps, but if you want to see the full length text, you need to use some interlibrary loans through your library and through this database. And also, you also need to go to the, like I mentioned, Shanghai library. You need to use their system to see the printed works. Especially for some academic journals, some of them you can access it from a database called CNKI. I forgot the full name of it, something like a China Knowledge Database. It collected a lot of journal articles, but you still need to go to some real libraries to get access. And one case that I want to bring that exemplifies the intersection of literary texts, public discussions on cybernetics, and academic perspectives on cybernetics was a 1963 short story named The Brain Broadcasting Station. This story features a metal hand automatically writing on the paper. Why it can automatically write? Because in the story it says that it is controlled by a scientist in the next room using the brain-generated electricity. The scientist explained that the human thought, when humans think, it produces some electric currents, which can be transmitted to a mechanical hand, allowing it to write. And what the mechanical hand write down in the story was, I quote, "Using bioelectricity to control machines is an effective method for automation." And very interestingly, this story is not purely fictional. At the 1958 Brussels World Expo, a Soviet Union's exhibition demonstrated a thought-controlled mechanical hand. I cannot find a picture of the demonstration about the demonstration, but these are some posters of the 58 Expo. And this Soviet Union's demonstration was reported in 1959 in Chinese in People's Daily. So it is very likely that the short story I mentioned was inspired by the Soviet performance. And moreover, the Soviet performance is also connected to Norbert Wiener and his colleagues' research on cybernetics. So one of Wiener's surgeon and also his colleague traveled to the Soviet Union to observe the Russian hand. And this observation finally contributed to the development of Boston arm, an early male electric prosthesis. Yeah. So, and in my research, I found that both the brain broadcasting station story, like the short brain broadcasting station, and some articles in People's Daily, their discussion on the human-machine relationship then mainly focus on cybernetics as a pragmatic tool for automation, rather than as a means of redefining human identity. So I think this is quite a pragmatic understanding of cybernetics. It's production-oriented, and it also maintains a clear distinction between humans and machines. However, recently I reread some of the articles and reports in the Science Pictorial Journal, and I found that in one 1962's article, it is entitled Neurocybernetics. And well, this article, like the stories and the reports I just mentioned, although it also maintained the political distinction between humans and machines, reject the parallel between human thoughts and between considering humans as a kind of computational machine. But this article also suggested that cybernetics could aid in understanding brain's physiology. So this is an interpretation that diverged from the industrial focus seen in the science fiction and newspaper reports. So I'm still currently analyzing those material to explore how different periodicals framed cybernetics differently in distinct contexts. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Stop share for a moment for Dr. Shapiro.
Okay. I'm sorry that I don't have any slides, which might have helped with some of the quotations, but I'll try to both speak clearly and speak quickly so that we don't run out of time. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so my title is Hybridity and its Discontents, and I'm talking about a recent science fiction novel, Alien Clay, by the British writer Adrian Tchaikovsky. Okay, Adrian Tchaikovsky's 2024 novel Alien Clay deals in novel ways with the old science fictional scenario of human encounters with alien life forms. The protagonist narrator, Arton Dagdev, is a biologist, or more precisely a xenoecologist. That is to say, he studies ecological systems in which multiple life forms coexist, interact with one another, and also partly sculpt the surrounding environment, as well as being both enabled and constrained by the affordances and limits of that environment. This makes Arton a practitioner of what you can call Earth system science. And I'll skip definitions, but it's Earth system science tries to see ecologically the interconnections of all living and non-living things on Earth. Of course, for now, it's only on Earth that this is studied, but in science fictional extrapolation, we'll see it about other planets as well. In the present moment, Earth system science obviously has only one area application, the Earth itself. But presumably the same principles ought to apply to other planets, especially those which have developed the complexity necessary for life. Tchaikovsky's science fiction novel extrapolates from our actual situation. At the unspecified future time when the novel takes place, human beings have surveyed 78 planets orbiting other stars that seem to have conditions suitable for life to develop. Of these 78, 9 actually have life of some kind. 6 of the 9 feature only microbes. The remaining 3 have macroscopic life. And one of the 3, IMO 27G, more popularly known as Kiln, K-A-L-N, has a climate that is relatively tolerable for human beings. Against this background, Alien Clay considers the question of what it means to be human and how the category of the human relates to other possibilities of life. Tchaikovsky is extrapolating from a long history of how human nature has been described and how this definition has been applied to categorize and to differentiate among actual people, who is regarded as being fully human and who is regarded as only being incompletely or unsatisfactorily so. The difference between human beings and other biological organisms has also been applied throughout modern European history to distinctions among different members of the human species. This makes it hard to extract discourses of the human from a long history of racism and colonialization. And here I turn to the Jane Bacon philosopher and writer Sylvia Wynter, who we've already heard about in Baker's talk. She starting with the Renaissance in Europe and concomitantly with the European colonization of the Americas, as well as much of Africa and parts of Asia, concepts of what it meant to be human were for the first time dissociated from religion and Christianity and restated on a secular basis. The new conceptualization of the human appealed to universalism in a certain sense, but it also sought to differentiate Europeans from other human beings whom they killed, enslaved, and otherwise dominated. This led to what Wynter calls the overrepresentation of the idealized figure of man, capital M, man. Colonized human beings, while not white or European, and not white or not European, were seen as failing to conform to this idealized figure, and this was used to justify the subordination of indigenous populations to the demands of European colonialism. So I have a quote from Catherine McKittrick, who's summarizing Wynter's arguments. The human in Wynter's writings is representatively linked to the figure of man one, invented by the Renaissance, and then man two, invented in the 18th century at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So both of in both of these figures, we have powerful novel systems and origin stories that explain who, what we are. These systems and stories produce the lived and racialized categories of the rational and irrational, the selected and the disselected, the haves and the have-nots as asymmetrical, naturalized racial, sexual, human groupings that are specific to time, place, and personhood, yet signal the processes through which the empirical and experiential lives of all humans are increasingly subordinated to a figure that thrives on accumulation. So that's all a quote from McKittrick about Wynter. The point is, I think, that different models of the human fit in with the political imperatives of European colonialism, and this leads to definitions in which male, white, cis European, and straight cis Europeans are really man, capital M, and everybody else is not quite up to snuff or not quite up to being fully human. Now, in Alien Clay, we don't really have anything about race and sex differences among human beings, but we have this put on another level where human beings are encountering other life forms. So everything in Alien Clay turns upon the question of what it means to be human. It's almost poetic. The Earth is ruled by a totalitarian dictatorship called the Mandate, and the Mandate has a firm ideology of human supremacy, or maybe just humanism. The Mandate regards human beings as a crown of creation, the optimal form that life could ever take, and it subordinates biological and ecological science together with everything else to the task of reinforcing the supremacy of quote, capital M, man. Indeed, and the planet Kiln is of special interest to the Mandate because it has a rich and teeming biosphere. Its life forms are clearly the product of long processes of Darwinian evolution, and the essential stuff of Kiln's biology is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, as well as those familiar building blocks like amino acids. So it's similar to Earth life. The underlying similarity allows the life of Kiln to hybridize itself with earthly life forms, however, including with human beings, and for the Mandate is horrified with this, regards any such contact as dangerous contamination. And so it's good for the Mandate that this is compatible with Earth life because it shows the importance of Earth life or the exemplarity of Earth life. At the same time, it's a bad thing because it means that human beings are getting contaminated by presumably inferior biological forms. Okay, and they have even more of a problem because the Mandate discovers that not only does the planet of Kiln have a vibrant biosphere, it also contains signs of human-level sapience in the form of large structures that could not have arisen naturally. In other words, they're complex and planned enough that they are not like termite mounds or beehives, but look more like human architecture, but the beings who created them don't seem to be present. This leads to the presumption, necessarily so given the mandate's humanistic ideology, that the builders must have been analogous to human beings in some important way, even though they evolved separately on a planet 30 light years away from Earth. But nobody can find the builders or even fossil records of their past existence. This is the problem that the protagonist, Arton Dagdev, is asked to help solve. Arton is a political prisoner. In his work back on Earth, he had dared to explore scientific possibilities that went beyond the bounds of what the mandate considered acceptable. In punishment, he's been sent to a forced labor camp on the planet Kiln. He knows that he will never be allowed to return to Earth. However much longer he lives, he will die in Kiln. Together with the other prisoners, Arton is set up at work to research Kiln's alien life. So we have these kind of contrasting imperatives. On the one time, they want to learn as much about this so they can dominate it and control it. At the same time, they want to maintain the humanist ideology intact, so they can't accept that anything which is radically unhuman or non-human could be capable of intelligence and sapience. And so this leads to a double bind. The ideology controls and therefore distorts scientific research. We do know that science is all too often entangled with and subordinated to political conditions of power and domination. Philosophers in the West since Francis Bacon have described scientific experimentation as a way of forcing nature to reveal its secrets to us, just as government works to force us to obey the conditions imposed by the sovereign. Francis Bacon, who wrote about science, was a contemporary of Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan about political control. These go hand in hand. The subordination of knowledge, discovery, and production to the demands of political power is all the more constraining today, I'd say, when scientific research tends to be so expensive that its agendas are dictated by the corporations and governments that pay for it. And it consists often in brute force attacks upon its very object of study. But this is really only the half of the story. The Belgian philosopher Isabel Stengers, who's probably done more than anyone else to warn us of the imperialistic impositions of big science when it seeks to silence all competing discourses, but Stengers has also taught us of the obligations that scientific practice, if it's done properly, imposes upon us. Science is just one mode among many others of interaction with the world around us, but what makes scientific practice different from so many other practices is precisely that, when carried out carefully and modestly, it is impelled and circumscribed by the very conditions that it unexpectedly discovers. A true scientific discovery forces us or obligates us to follow where it leads. Aileen Clay therefore draws a wedge between the conflicting scientific imperatives of domination and control on one hand and obligation to what's discovered on the other hand. The prisoners are forced to aid the mandate scientists in their research. The abundant life on Kiln must be dissected and understood, but this alien life is also considered to be a menace that must be kept at bay, and it's targeted only from a distance. The mandate only seeks to understand Kiln for the purpose of domination and weaponization. This ambition is accomplished and shadowed, however, by an extreme fear of contamination, which reaches almost pathological extremes. The scientists working for the mandate have a whole series of strict decontamination procedures. Prisoners are also decontaminated when they leave the enclosure and get in contact with Kiln life, but the procedures for them are less rigorous because they sort of feel, if they do get contaminated, they'll just die, and that'll be their punishment, which they deserve anyway. As Arton both does research for the mandate and tries to engage with other prisoners in unsuccessful acts of rebellion, he's ultimately fully exposed to the life of Kiln, and he discovers in his own experience that the mandate's fear of contamination are misplaced. Kiln life is quite different from Earth life and is evolved in an entirely different way. Arton discovers that Kiln life is always composite and multiply compositional. In the novel, as in many of his works, Tchaikovsky offers us a brilliant speculative extrapolation of terrestrial biology. We know, I'm just summarizing common biological knowledge, that all eukaryotes, life made of cells with nuclei, which includes all multicellular life, are ultimately symbiotic organisms. At some point, billions of years ago, a bacterium was swallowed by an archaean, but instead of being dissolved and consumed by the engulfing organism, it continued functioning within it. This merger led to the first nucleated or eukaryotic cells. Other organelles in our cells, the mitochondria in all eukaryote life cells, which give us our energy, and the chloroplasts in plants, which perform photosynthesis, were also formerly independent organisms with their own genomes that eventually were incorporated into the cell assemblage. On Earth, such symbiosis did not take place quite in the same way on larger than cellular levels, with a few exceptions. Lichens are composed of algae and fungi in close inseparable association. And Earth biology on large scales, however, mostly depends on less intimate forms of symbiotic cooperation. Think of nitrogen fixation, which is essential to all plants. They cannot take nitrogen from the atmosphere themselves. They rely on nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil, and nearly all plant life on land is associated with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but they haven't fused into the same organism the way chloroplasts and mitochondria have. So in Alien Clay, what Tchaikovsky does is he imagines an alternative or speculates on an alternative biosphere in which symbiosis occurs in somewhat different ways, but goes to really radical extents. The animal-like and plant-like organisms on Kiln are all symbiotic confederations, more separate from one another than mitochondria are from the cells containing them, but at the same time, even more closely entangled with one another than trees are from the nitrogen-fixing bacteria they rely on. Though, for instance, if you examine something from Kiln that seems like an earthly animal, you'll find that its eyes are one organism, its ears another, and its feet yet another, and its stomach yet another. The organisms on Kiln do prey upon one another. Darwinian competition really works in an entirely different way. Different sorts of eyes, for instance, compete with one another to be included in larger bodily extremities. Every living thing on the planet is a multiplicity of this sort, like a mix and match conglomeration of Lego pieces. This results in life forms that cannot be hierarchized in the ways that human thought all too often attempts to do. Mysterious structures that are scattered all over Kiln, which they try to find out who made them, are not in any sense human constructions. They are the results of the ways that Kiln life can come together in large conglomerations and then split apart again into smaller and more separate groupings. And this also seems to happen on geological scales in terms of climate changes. Symbiotic associations on Kiln are loose and continually changing. They do not have truck with permanence. On Kiln, therefore, the forces of life resist both absorption within one another and separation from one another. This also means that they resist control and manipulation of the sort that human beings have imposed upon so many other animals and plants. And this also compromises the sort of control that the mandate seeks to impose upon individual human beings, including their prisoners. Radical hybridity on every level frustrates any will to domination. The contamination so phobically feared by the mandate is really a process of combinatorial augmentation. Eaton takes several chapters to describe what it's like to be infected, in quotes, by Kiln life. The boundaries of the individual are breached, but separate people are not fused into some sort of monstrous hive mind. The effect, once the prisoners have breathed the spores of Kiln life and been colonized, that of becoming, and this is a quote from the book, one amongst many, yes, but not many becoming one. Each person retains his or her own selfhood or individuality. The boundaries between selves do not dissolve. It's just that these boundaries have become selectively porous in the same ways that the membranes of individual cells already are. The individual prisoners have become a sort of we, something that allows them finally to overthrow their jailers, but that also does not lock them into other sorts of homogeneity or hierarchy. And a lot of the book is given like very detailed, almost naturalistic descriptions of this alternative biology, but I think the point is to draw out the complexity that they're neither separate in the way human beings today on Earth are separate, but nor are they fused into some kind of hive mind or overmind or group organism. It's sort of this fascinating in-betweenness, and I think that's the main thing Tchaikovsky's trying to speculatively develop in the course of the book. So the book ends with a small-scale revolution as the prisoner of Kiln finally succeed in overthrowing their jailers. Eaton continues to emphasize that the solidarity of the revolutionaries does not entail the suppression or supersession of their individuality. Rather, and here's another long quote from the book, the thing about solidarity, about being the crowd which acts with unity of purpose, is that you have to make the same calculations as the hive mind does, but with none of its impunity. You're not the chess master moving out your sacrificial pawns. You're the pawns themselves, decided together that sacrifices must be made. So sacrifices are necessary. There's no clean and easy path even to overthrowing a dictatorship. I don't have the time here to unfold all the full intricacy of the process of hybridization that Alien Clay narrates for us. The prisoners are all human beings, but their liberation involves the way they become more than human, or better, not quite human anymore. The power arises from the ways in which they are connected, but not combined. The book ends with the narrator anticipating a new space journey now that he's freed to bring the life of Kiln back to Earth. This would mean subjecting our home planet to alien contact, or what is often publicly seen as contamination in its own right. And here I think, it's hard for me to describe this, but the ending of the book is really great because of its mixed tone. It's triumphant and celebratory, but at the same time, since these are people talking about infecting, put that in quotes, the entire Earth biosphere with an alien force, So it's very positive. I mean, liberatory, celebratory. At the same time, it's slightly creepy and menacing also, because this is not a utopian change that everything's going to be made great. And as Artun says towards the end of the book, alien is only ever a transient state in the biosphere of Kiln. That alienists will always get to know you in the end. Thank you.
Let's hope this doesn't die while I start talking. That would be really funny, though. Oh, never mind. Okay. That would be crazy if it died. Anyway, hi, I'm Angelica. I come from SDSU, San Diego State University. I'm in the one dude. One dude in the crowd. I am in the master's program in feminist studies at SDSU. I am in my second year. Hope to graduate soon. My research interests sort of revolve around cultural studies, public memory, as well as queer Chicanx art. So kind of variants. So I'm excited to. This is a weird mouse. I can see why some of y'all were like, what does technology do? Because I'm still like, what do you mean I have to use both my hands? Hello. Hope you like my presentation. I did dress up for it. I brought the glasses that look really similar. So I hope you guys like it. So this is going to be a queer horror analysis of Blade. So it's sort of tying together conceptions of horror as a genre, which has much history in regards to parallel world building. So I wanted to tie that into Blade, the film, despite the fact that it's not necessarily scary inherently or within horror genre, but as characters arise, like the vampires within, I did want to sort of show the parallels between and show that it's super gay, like really, really gay. All right, so warning for any of you who haven't seen the movie, why, but also spoilers. I won't go like too in depth, and also the movie's been out for like over 20 years, 25 years. I don't know what year it is. But either way, it's been out for a while, so sorry. But I did want to start with, this movie came out in, I believe, 1998, and Marvel Entertainment filed for bankruptcy in 1996. So this was like their last ditch attempt to sort of revive their comic book movie genre as a whole. And I'd like to think it worked, honestly. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, let's get into the movie itself. So this movie begins in 1967. It's first showing like a pregnant woman suffering from a fatal vampire attack, which triggers her premature labor. Her son, Eric, who will references Blade for the rest of the presentation, inherits vampire strengths, but only a couple of weaknesses, becoming like a hybrid. To avoid harming humans, he takes a serum to suppress, his need to feed on human blood. And in 1998 in Los Angeles, which is where the film takes place and when the film was released, vampires live secretly among humans, but Deacon Frost, which is the villain, is a turned vampire, which I'll get into in a second, seeks to overturn this by awakening a legendary blood god, quote unquote. Blade fights to stop him, ultimately defeating him and his followers with a mix of vampire weaknesses and chemicals. All right, so first I'll talk about the vampire variants. So I'm going to talk about the two main types within the film. So there are turned vampires and there are born vampires. Turned vampires are ones who were born human, but were bitten, sort of the classically, they became human eventually, or they became vampires eventually. And born ones are kind of, as it states, sort of born. They have the same strengths, same weaknesses. There is a hierarchy, though, between born and made vampires. One of the like differences that I know is like the way they're dressed. So it's sort of stereotypically aristocratic and very gothic, also very corporate. So, it's classic suit and tie, which we'll get into the implications of that in a second. And then the more quote unquote youthful vampires who are maybe turned more recently or just turned in general are dressed more trendy and in style with 90s fashion. And just an overall transgression of these vampires. Well, we mostly see the younger ones, but it's not always seen by human eyes. Is their sexual transgressions, which is sort of like a main note in the comparison of how they relate to the sort of classic, iconic, like vampire in regards to Victorian era, which I'll get to in a second. And in, many of the scenes we see them, they are very physically affectionate with each other, literally performing sex acts. This movie's rated R. I should have said that in the beginning. But, that sort of sets the stage as to what kind of vampires they will be for the rest of the movie and sort of also imply certain things about who Blade is. All right, so first we're going to get into the comparison and drawing the parallels of how this relates to horror as a genre overall. So as discussed by Kendall Phillips in Projected Fears, Horror Films and American Culture and his chapter on Dracula released in 1931, he touches on the political and cultural context in which the movie Dracula was created and sort of the mix of immigrant trends and the emerging sexual revolution in the 90s going hand in hand with what was happening in the 30s and sort of the emerging struggle for queer rights. And then that ties in to, as it's kind of mentioned in Blade, the serial murder that all of these vampires are committing because they're trying to gain more traction and more power, more visible power, at least in the human world, which is part of their struggle, which I'll talk about a little more in a second, and how that I believe is connected to the representations and in line with representations with Jeffrey Dahmer in the 90s and the popular horror Silence of the Lamb, both of which do have to do with cannibalism, as does, vampires in the sense of they're drinking your blood. That is my human blood that you're drinking right there. So the vampire is almost a variant in the sense of how they're deviant. Okay. So let me see. So like I said, there is a hierarchy, and I like to view this hierarchy in regards to the fact that this vampire is outrightly queer in the sense of they do draw lines between Dracula, which, was sort of a commentary on Victorian repressed sexuality, but also how the hierarchy itself sort of shows, to me at least, growing visibility of the queer community in the 90s with pureblood vampires, most like upper class queer individuals, many of them white, who had resources to stay within the heteronormative norms. In contrast, many lower class and POC queer individuals were unable or unwilling to assimilate as easily. So I sort of see Deacon Frost as one of these younger, visible queer individuals who is trying to gain more traction and more power within the visible human world. And a lot of these turned vampires are becoming more progressively outspoken, taking drastic and dramatic measures to represent themselves. That's most displayed in literally the opening scene with a man being seduced into going to a rave, but it's plot twist, a blood rave, and everyone just gets doused in blood. That's a picture of it right there. And they all like try and proceed to eat him. So I don't know, that feels gay. And I think one of the most like striking and damning assertions of this as correct is also the portrayal of vampires alluding to the AIDS crisis and its stigmatization of queer individuals, both with Blade's like hybrid nature and his reliance on serum, AZT break anyone, to suppress his vampiric urges, and raises questions about whether or not it's just an infection or whether it's a species. And I inserted a quote from one of the characters there: "Vampires like you aren't a species, you're just infected, a virus, a sexually transmitted disease," which is really poignant and on the nose, but yeah, I don't know. That's really queer coded. I think that's outrightly queer coded, actually. So Interesting. So also in line with the parallels between Dracula and Blade, working from English professor Hamilton Carroll. So the immigration trends, like I was discussing before, within the 30s is also reflected here in the 90s, or at least in this 90s movie, where the vampire populace can be seen as a more powerful collective pushing towards becoming even more overtly queer, but also becoming less palpable to heteronormative society. And it directs to Carol's assertion of I meant to say transnational. That says transitional. I'm so sorry, y'all. Transnational subjects being brought into the world to further, quote unquote, overtake citizens of that society, and the quote unquote citizens of that society in the context of Blade are humans. So working as the corrosive power of transnational capital, vampires, both born and made, they both speak to further anxieties about our quote unquote penetrable national border, with deviant outsiders like these vampires are able to infiltrate, both remain unseen and are thriving in our national system and culture. So having both of these notions in mind of these vampires speaking towards an immigrant population in the 90s and also a queer population, that really begs the question of what does Blade stand for in this metaphor, in terms of like, is he an outsider trying to come in? Is he an insider like fighting everyone else trying to pull him out? Like, how does he stand here, and how does he navigate his very, very complex world where he's trying to defeat what he basically is? So, spoiler, this is in the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. So if you guys like Marvel, like I do, more recently anyway, I just wanted to bring up like how this definitely kicked off Marvel's resurgence, specifically with the X-Men, which came out in 2000, and definitely sparked a conversation with, with Marvel and what they thought was profitable in regards to parallel world building. And it was successful in the beginning because X-Men is definitely one of those comics that works within metaphor and parallel world building, but it slowly, I think, got more and more watered down from that point. And now they think, yes, everyone just likes cool action, pew, pew, pew. But in reality, it's the world building that everyone likes. So it's really just saying like, hey, we want interesting and thorough characters that can speak to our existence currently, past, present, future, etc. And not just like some dude taking his shirt off. Don't get me wrong, we go on both, but like, so thank you very much.
Speaking into the microphone. We'll now go to questions. Should I facilitate or? Okay, as you wish. Yes, we have one right there already. Thank you so much, Lord.
So I couldn't help but hear resonances between R and Stephen's presentations. Both kind of looked at the problems with ideas of individuality when we bring in these aliens and how they challenge these human notions that we hold very dear about how we are individuals that are autonomous and all that sort. And that made me think of Judith Butler's idea of precarity, and that we are all reliant on each other and interdependent. So ideas of individuality are somewhat flawed and result in us not having, requisite faith in humans and what we owe each other. So I'm curious how your papers interact with that.
I think, again, the novel I was talking about very much concerned with
getting rid of a binary that we either are all separate individuals or all one, and we have a complete distinctive spike mind or something like that. And then that, I mean, that kind of duality, the one or the other, that kind of binary has defined a lot of science fiction, and I think a lot of cultural hopes and fears like in modern times. And I think the novel, which I was talking about, is very much trying to get away from that either or. That you could have, I don't want to say both and instead of either or, but that it's something else. It's not either totally separate or you're totally combined. And I mean, this relates to stuff like, relates to questions of ecology where all life forms are very much intertwined, even though some of them destroy others of them. And, this relates to the whole question of sun and plants, because plants don't have to destroy anybody if they get their energy from the sun, but most life forms do. So, I don't know. I related just to Adrian Tchaikovsky is a very interesting contemporary scientist writer. He's also alarmingly prolific, kind of years and writes like 2 or 3 500 page books every single year. How could anybody write that fast? It's funny, weird. But anyway, one of the things he does, and I think science fiction in general does, this author does particularly, is precisely to sort of think about all these arrangements, think about things which are not human, which are alien, but which also break down a binary between this is us and that's them. So, I mean, I would answer in those terms. And then I'd also, Baker and I both independently had reference to Sylvia Wynter, whose major work is essentially about seeing how certain images of man, M-A-N, capital M, have become hegemonic, which relates to gender, race, and all sorts of other things, because it sets up a model of what humans are supposed to be like, and sets up hierarchies by how well you conform to them. So that's what I think.
That's pretty good. Think about it.
Try the other one.
Swap the mic. It's like musical chip. Right. I agree with everything that Steve said, as well as the fact that I do think that it's an extraordinarily feminist concept that Butler brings up with regard to precarity, with regard to the interdependence of all life. And it stands in contrast with a sort of fetishization of the individual, of man with a capital M, of bootstraps ideology. And one reason why both of the texts that I pointed to, I wasn't able to talk very much about the cli-fi aspects of it. I know some folks don't like that moniker, climate fiction, if you prefer. Both are deeply ecological, right? The astronaut team in Chambers is for people who are basically going to spend the rest of their lives together, and they are, in fact, a polycule. That's part of how they manage to not kill each other. And very carefully managed and balanced polycule of people who are multigender and multisexuality, including an individual who is asexual, who is very much an intimate member of that family, but not in a sexual way, right? Butler's novel problematizes consent in different ways. For the Oankali, consent has to do with pheromones. It has to do with what they see as biological necessity. For humans, of course, consent needs to be verbal and clear. Let's not mince words with that. But it does, as human-Oankali hybrids start to people the books in later on in the trilogy, they have a sort of mixed sensibility with that. And I think that both texts really work toward what would it mean for the boundary of the human to be porous, but not to be colonizing other species and other worlds. Thank you. And I know we're about at time, but perhaps we have time for one more. Oh, yes, we have one right there. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think I have two questions. Maybe one for Angelica and one for the panel more generally. So the question I have for Angelica is I'm wondering if, as you thought through vampirism and queerness, if there was also like some consideration of transness in the sort of metaphorical work being done in Blade. I think of Blade as a kind of like stealth character. So I'm curious about what you think about Blade's embodiment of like stealthness, if that makes sense. And then for all of you, I am curious about how this idea of almost like people existing inside of each other, or like this sort of babushka experience of humanity and of life is maybe playing out in your work, because I think there is possibly an interesting through line of consumption and coexistence as expressed through like this concentric way of living, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Powerhouse of the cell. To answer your question, I did more so in the sense of when I discuss Blade as queer, I don't necessarily mean that meaning like just bisexuality. I do want to include like other aspects of gender queer. So I guess, yeah, you could consider it in terms of the vampires being like able to pass within a certain aspect, because they do talk about in the film of like vampire sunscreen, so they like can go outside during the day. And while Blade doesn't need it, I guess it could be, I don't know. Are you thinking of like his injections that he has to take to suppress it? Those are like his hormones. Because that could be fun.
Yeah, that was a sort of parallel I had in mind. And I think you could also make the case for him embodying almost a kind of homonormativity in his rejection of...
I definitely thought about that, like throughout my paper, homonormativity. That was like a big theme in regards to like some of these vampires are trying to pass and just like skate by in the background. And some of these are like, no, we actually need to be ruling the entire land, which is like an interesting conversation to have, especially regarding identities that are considered very deviant just across the board. I mean, Dracula was written, the 17th century? So, I don't know. A really long time ago. And then does anyone want to try and tackle their second question? I might need a minute with the other one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I'm really thinking about like at one level, like the whole, and this goes back to like how do we like destabilize the idea of like man with capital M, and how like the multi-species idea is like a good counter to that. Very simply, like just thinking about ourself, not only as ourself, as how like the gut bacteria within us kind of like really make up, really contribute to like us being and existing and living. And so like that's one aspect of the inside within the inside and the species within the species, and the way in which we understand ourselves as like this one entity in itself is maybe like a bit of a it's a bit of a myth, and there is something generative about like disturbing that, and then so that's like one part of things that I'm excited about, and then the other part is like still it's more like inexplicable to me, and that is the like more phenomenological experience wherein like I'm not even able to go back to science and say that, or maybe I need to like work harder to find like the science of it. But it's this idea of like, okay, I'm in the sun, I'm basking, it died. Oh wait, it's back. Sorry. It's like I'm feeling like massively depressed, and then I go outside and I lay in the sun, and then there is this like experience of nourishment or rejuvenation. And we know that, of course, like there's a lot of like ecological elements to how like we function chemically. And so in ways in which like it's the experience of it is there's just so much going on that like that I don't even want to say that it's like, oh, we're plants. It's like this meme that's out there where basically plants, we need hydration and we need light. And to a certain degree, yeah, it's kind of nice to like think of it that way, that we are plant-like, and that in some ways like expands this human idea that we've associated ourselves with. And then also like what's going on. There's so much more, and I think that literature is like a good place to go to try to make sense of that outside of science.
Thank you for the question. I might need to reconfirm the question. Is your question about the different species of human, the multi-species of human, the dismantle of the concept of man?
Oh, it's the sun. Okay. Yeah. I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think, yes. And you can make a sort of connection between a destabilization of like this discrete sort of individualistic understanding of what a person is that is divorced from other beings.
Okay. Thanks for the question. I do the socialist attacks is a little bit different from what other panelists. So the social mentioned in my talk presentation, the socialist attacks, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, they do hold a very rigid boundary between humans and machines, because according to the Marxist Maoist ideology, they think that is a product of social relationships. However, the machines, they are just okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Therefore, it is considered the machine is inferior to human. The human are always superior. However, I found that in some socialist Chinese science fictions, they present a more complex picture. For example, like they said that the machine also offer labor to the human machine system, and humans who enjoy the service offered by the human machine integration, they do pay some affirmation and a demand to the machine. Therefore, I think this kind of thing, issue related to labor do complex the rigid distinction between humans and machines, because in this context, the machine, they are also considered as something that can offer the labor and accepted by human beings themselves. Thank you.
I kind of thought in regards to like almost interspecies, but also definitely not, because I am definitely talking about queerness and gender and all that sort of fun stuff. So I mostly thinking of Susan Stryker's conceptualization of Frankenstein. Well, definitely while I was thinking of this, and just additionally through like how everyone's talks, just the concept of being human sort of being interspersed and like just pieced together with other conceptions of species or worlds or mythological species, in the sense of like we are talking about various monsters and aliens and etc. So conceptualizing that with only what it means to be human, and then like including like concepts and conversations that we are having about gender and sexuality, I think further complicates what it means to be, especially within the realms of speculative fiction. So
I'm not sure I have much to add to whatever people said or what I said before, but again, I think one of the issues is that whenever you set up an ideal model, like in this novel, always when this is man, capital M, it always negates plurality and multiplicity, both the fact that, people are not all identical. And if you have a model, then you have this thing where you grade actual people by how close they are to the model and how far away they are from the model. And that's why the model is often an idealization which has certain gender, racial concepts, and was used by European colonization against people who they colonized and exploited. So one of the and then related to that, thinking of humanism instead of man, capital M, also means that whether it's machines or other living entities, that somehow they're fundamentally different from us and have to be kept away or have to be subordinated. So I wouldn't totally deny the fear of, again, contamination is a very loaded word. It's a very bad word because it means something if you really talk about like a virus which kills me, whether it's HIV or the flu or whatever. But it always lends itself to a kind of excessive fixation and purity, which serves power, domination and hierarchy. And so what we need, and what I think speculative fiction often does, there's fascist speculative fiction too, obviously it exists, but what speculative fiction does is precisely sort of smudge the boundaries and make more fluid and flexible associations possible, and think about how associations can be symbiotic or mutually beneficial as opposed to oppressive and dominating.
I agree with everything that folks are saying about this. And I think that I do actually think that part of the turn into thinking cybernetically, into thinking about plants, food studies, climate fictions, speculative fiction as decentering the lone human explorer going into parts unknown. I do think that, I hope that this is sort of indicative of a larger systemic shift as people realize to draw upon but misquote Andor, that any kind of dominance authoritarianism is always fragile. It's always based on categories that are exclusive rather than inclusive. It's based on an us and a them. And I think that all of these fictions in various ways are trying to break down that boundary in the service of having a future and not simply being stuck in a stagnant same cycle over and over and over of what has been considered human. Because as Steve also points out, that's always based on an ideal model that is by necessity excluding other types of humanity or other types of personhood. The Oankali are not human, but they are people. And to think of them as not people is an egregious neo-colonial act as well. So thank you for the question. Oh, yes.
I just sort of one more thing to add. This is an issue which resounds through the kind of history of science fiction over the past 100 years. John W. Campbell, the famous and notorious editor of Astounding, I can't remember which, astounding science fiction, was very prescriptive in telling all his authors what they had to do. And one of the things he was very big on is that if humans encounter aliens or other species of humans, must always conquer and be triumphant and stuff like that. And, Campbell was very sexist and racist. He rejected Samuel Delaney's first stories because Delaney was not a straight white man, basically. And part of, I think, if you're doing a history of science fiction over the past century, part of what's happened is how much that's changed and how much we have women writers, queer writers, non-white writers, and all kinds of other things going on in science fiction. Science fiction has become, today, I think the genre where this kind of multiplicity is most welcomed, whereas it used to be one which was very strictly ideologically trying to repress that.
I certainly hope so. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think we all hope so. We all hope that the future looks different, better even. Thank you all. And thank you everyone for being here today. I am so glad that we have had such rich discussions over these 2 days. And I'm just tremendously grateful to everyone for sharing your ideas and for being committed to doing that, for coming all this way or signing on or off all this way to share ideas and to really be committed to you doing that wherever we are. Thank you.